Hello, and welcome to Now Where Were We? A series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. Your host for this program is Deborah Ross. In this series, Deb takes us to locations that inform us about the history of our community. She also visits with local historians. We welcome your feedback and suggestions.
Who's going to be the Bigelow House today?
Oh, there's a class from the Evergreen State College coming.
Fantastic.
Yes,
Oh,
yeah.
good. Yeah. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Now Where Were We? An ongoing series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. I'm Deborah Ross. And today is the second in our series that I'm calling Iconic Intersections. In each of these, we're going to pick an intersection in our area that's kind of emblematic of a theme of our history. Today, we're at the intersection of 5th Avenue and Columbia, and we're going to be talking about the history of Chinese in Olympia. And I'm very, very pleased and privileged to have with me today Ed Echtle, a local historian who has specialized in this topic.
Thank you very much.
Now, here at 5th and Columbia, as long as I've been living in Olympia, there have been Asian restaurants, and we can see behind us, there still are. In fact, there's a new one right in front of us, a new Japanese restaurant. But the history of Chinese at this intersection goes a lot further back than my experience in Olympia. Is that right?
That's correct. It goes back, the first businesses that were here arrived at this intersection in the 1880s, late 1880s. But before that, there was a Chinatown about a block away from here. And there's actually a history of Chinese immigrants living and working in Olympia all the way back to the beginning. Edmund Sylvester, the founder of Olympia, actually had a Chinese cook in 1852, 20 years before the railroads came. The gold rush was the first big pull for Chinese to come to America. This is back in, California in 1849, 1850. And from that time, they spread out following new gold rushes. However, there were laws that kept Chinese from competing in gold rush claims. And so that's why they started diversifying into other businesses where they weren't in competition with white male labor. That's why they went into laundries and restaurants and market gardening, and that's what they were doing here mostly.
Was there a particular part of Olympia or our area that Chinese congregated in and lived in and did business in?
Well, they were dispersed throughout town, but there were sort of centers. There were 3 Chinatowns, not all at the same time. The first Chinatown was on 4th between Columbia and Capitol Way on the south side. And then up in the late 1880s, that's when they moved to this site here on the south side of 5th Avenue, just behind where we are right now. And then in 1913, they actually physically moved the buildings down to Water Street. And that was the last location of Chinatown, and that lasted till 1943. Most of the people here were members of the Locke family. It was a chain migration situation where a few came early on and then wrote home and said there's work here, and so that's why most of them here were Lockes.
And I know we're acquainted with some of those descendants, and some of them are quite prominent now. Can you name some of the ones that are still around here or in Washington State?
Well, of course, there's Governor Locke, the former governor from 1996 to 2004. And his grandfather came and actually worked as a house servant over on the east side of Olympia. And Governor Locke mentioned that a few times in different speeches. The restaurants that were here, I know the China Clipper was a Locke restaurant, although I've never tracked down the descendants that own that. Kay's Cafe, which many people remember as the late night hangout here in Olympia, it was on Capitol Way between 4th Avenue and State Street. That was founded in 1941 and lasted till 1976. And Toy K is still very active in the community in a number of organizations. And she's also an Evergreen alumni, which I know she's very proud of.
Ed, you were responsible, in fact, for, or partly responsible anyway, for having a plaque erected near the Heritage Fountain that celebrates our Chinese history. Can you tell me a little bit more about how that came about?
Well, the plaque project came about when we all decided that it would be great to commemorate the last location of Chinatown. That's why the marker is where it is, in Heritage Park. And we put that together and installed it in 2004. And there was grants from the city of Olympia and from the Olympia Chinese Association.
What was the attitude of the city of Olympia and its residents towards the Chinese community here?
Well, in the early days, it seems like they were sort of accepted as a necessary part of the community. I'm not sure that they were very integrated in because of the language barrier. However, by the 1870s, 1880s, some organized labor organizations were actively using the issue of Chinese immigration as a recruiting tool for white labor. And so that was a big part of the anti-Chinese movement in the 1880s. The irony is that a lot of the people that were part of the anti-Chinese movement were actually immigrants themselves. When there was a uprising here by organized labor in 1885 and 1886, a number of towns expelled Chinese immigrants by force, Tacoma being the most notable example. In February of 1886, Seattle did as well. And Olympia tried to do it about 2 days later. However, Olympia was the capital of the territory at the time, and they were very committed to law and order. So there's kind of an ambivalence by the white population here. A lot of them didn't feel like Chinese immigrants were a good fit, but they also were against violence.
Ed, is there a Chinese cemetery in Olympia?
Well, there's not a cemetery that's entirely Chinese, dedicated to the Chinese. However, the Forest Cemetery over on the east side of town, now known as Forest Memorial Gardens, they had a Chinese section. And how that worked was that the Cemetery Association sold a section to one of the merchants, Sam von Locke, who was one of the most prominent merchants here. And the Locke Family Association managed the sale of plots within that. Now, how many people from that era are still there, we don't know. Why we don't know if there are any people there now is that they had a tradition of interning people for about 10 years, and then a monk would come visit the town. And they would travel to different towns, and they would exhume people who had been buried for 10 years or more and gather their bones into small metal boxes and then ship them through Victoria back to their ancestral burial ground. So there's probably some, but not everyone who's listed in the newspaper, being buried there is probably still there.
Well, I didn't know that. Thanks so much for that history. Very, very interesting. I've been to the cemetery, and it's a beautiful spot, and it is interesting to walk through the sections of the cemetery that are set aside for different people of different ethnic and religious backgrounds. So thanks so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Again, thanks, Ed, for agreeing to come talk on this chilly but sunny morning, and really appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
For those of you seeking to know more about the history of Chinese in Olympia, I highly recommend you're taking a look at Ed Echtle's series of articles on Chinese in Olympia on the website of the Olympia Historical Society and Bigelow House Museum. A link to those features is found here. Many of the images that are contained in this episode are also included in Ed's excellent series of articles.